Yeah, thank a lot, Leon, and hello everyone, and good evening from Vietnam. And my name is Minh Tú from the Vietnam North, and I am asked by Leon to be the facilitator of the online learning workshop today. And we believe we have two online learning workshops with presentation from the Indian, the Vietnam, the Mexico, and the Nim River Basin North. And today we have two presentations from the Canaan North and then the Netherlands North. And with the first presentation by the Canaan team, we will have first 25 minutes for the presentation, and then we have 20 minutes for the discussion, and then maybe we'll have a very short rap for 5 minutes, and then we continue with the second presentation today from the Netherlands team. And without further delay, I would like to hand over to the Canaan team for sharing their experiences and research results from the Kenya. And we go ahead, the Canaan team. Welcome. Very welcome.
Thank you so much, Guyane, if I pronounce the name correctly. Thank you, team, for being available to listen to our workshop. We'll have a workshop today where we'll have it in 3 sessions. Will be presented by 3 different people, and then we can have a discussion at the end. So it will be started by Rispa, then immediately after Rispa, Christine, you take over, and then Joel. I hope by then Joel will have joined. I'll look for him. So, and then we can have the discussion. So, Rispa, please, can you proceed?
Thank you, Prof. Let me share my screen. So you can see it?
Yes, yes, we can see it. Rispa.
Yes, very clear. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present the Kenya node on problem diagnosis we did for the Yala wetland and also preparation for the Kingwal wetland. So as Professor Kitaka has indicated that I will start the presentation where I'll give the overview of our case studies and also the societal goals and the scientific goals we would want to achieve under our problem diagnosis phase. Joel will come in and look into pathways into and out of the problem, and Christine will look into just a brief overview of what she's dealing with in terms of scientific challenge and how what she's working on is connected to the societal goal, or what is she providing from the scientific challenge to the society. So as you all know that we are working in 2 case studies, that is Yala and Kingwal wetlands. So both wetlands are found in one of the river basins in Kenya, that is Yala River Basin. So Yala River Basin is one of the sub-basins of Lake Victoria. So Yala wetland is found downstream, just close to Lake Victoria, very down, close to the lake. And Kingwal wetland is found upstream. So we have 2 wetlands, one upstream, one downstream. So starting with our first case study, which is Yala wetland. So Yala wetland is said to be one of the largest or the largest freshwater wetland in Kenya because of its size, about 207 kilometers square. And the wetland actually is shared between 2 counties. That is Siaya on this side. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Siaya on this side and Busia on the other side. So Yala wetland actually, it's very, very important for the livelihoods of the communities neighboring it in terms of providing water for domestic use, also in terms of fisheries, because it has 3 satellite lakes where the local communities actually fish and get their livelihoods from it in terms of food and nutrition, and also in terms of income for those who are selling the fish. The wetland is also being used for food production by the local communities. So they grow crops, and this is mainly used for subsistence purposes. But there is also a private investor which is also using this wetland for cash crop production. This cash crop is mainly sugarcane. So he is using the wetland for sugarcane production. And right now there's a sugar demand in the country. So the wetland actually is contributing to meeting the sugar demand in the country. So the community are also using the wetland for livestock grazing and watering. And the papyrus is used for making handicraft like mats. Apart from this livelihood support, the wetland is also important in terms of water purification, in that all the water that comes from upstream or within the catchment is being drained into Yala, and the nutrients that come with the nutrients, the sediments, and other pollutants that come in from the catchment are retained within the wetland. So this wetland helps in reducing pollution into Lake Victoria. Apart from that, ecologically, the wetland is also important in terms of climate regulation, which Christine is dealing with in terms of carbon sequestration. So the wetland stores carbon mainly in the soil. So Christine will be looking into that. And apart from that, the wetland is very important in terms of biodiversity conservation. In that, the wetland is being recognized as an important bird area. There are bird species like the gray-crowned crane, which is actually recognized as a threatened endangered bird. And also we have antelopes, which are also endangered, nationally threatened in Kenya. They're found in these wetlands. Also, there are some fish species in this wetland, in one of the satellite lakes, like Lake Kanyaboli, which are actually extinct in the main lake, that is Lake Victoria, but they are still found in the wetland. So the wetland is important first in terms of livelihood support for the local communities, and also ecologically in terms of water purification and biodiversity conservation and climate regulation. Then going to the second case study, which is the Kingwal wetland. It is a smaller wetland compared to Yala, but it's also very important in terms of ecosystem services it provides. The wetland is divided into 3 sections, that is Upper Kingwal, Lower Kingwal, and the Middle Kingwal. This is just for management purposes. And just like Yala wetland, Kingwal is also important in terms of livelihood support for the local communities in terms of water provision, food crops, livestock grazing, and watering. Actually, these communities, they do a lot of livestock, let me call it livestock grazing and watering within the wetland. Unlike Yala wetland, where the people are not livestock keepers more. The other side, the livestock keepers are a few, but this other side, livestock keeping actually is one of the main sources of livelihood. So the wetland is very important in terms of livestock grazing and watering. There's also brick production, which is not in Yala wetland, but now in Kingwal we have brick production, and the community are also doing papyrus handicraft production. The wetland is also just like Yala in terms of climate regulation is very important, and also biodiversity conservation in terms of gray-crowned crane and also the Sintatunga antelope. So we have 2 very important wetlands in Kenya, which the Kenya node is working in. So despite all these benefits people, all the local communities are getting from the wetland, the main challenge here is that there's a lot of human activities taking place in these wetlands, which are threatening their existence, mainly the land conversion to cropping. And in Yala wetlands specifically, there are 2 issues. There's this unsustainable wetland utilization for cropping, and also there's inequity in terms of how the people are accessing the wetland in terms of land. How are they using it? And is there benefit sharing? Because the community feel that the private investor who is growing sugarcane in the wetland has been given more priority and more access to the land in the wetland to do sugarcane production. Meanwhile, the community do not have that much priority when it comes to accessing the land, using it, and even benefit sharing from what the private investor is doing, because they feel that sugarcane production, they're not benefiting from it in terms of labor and also other activities that are taking place within this area. So what has been done so far, or is being done to ensure that this wetland is still functioning and it's still providing the benefits supposed to provide to the communities and any other person which is dependent on the wetland, is that they've had community-driven initiatives like provision of alternative livelihood opportunities to reduce the pressure on the wetland, especially for cropping. So there have been initiatives by Nature Kenya, which is an NGO in Kenya, and also another NGO in Kingwal, who are taking initiatives to provide opportunities to reduce pressure on the wetlands, like providing beehives, providing fish feeds, to the local communities, especially the youth groups. There have also been initiatives to restore the wetland by replanting papyrus in degraded areas, and also like just leaving those areas to be naturally regenerate. This has been done by local communities, individuals, and also youth groups. Based on donors, what donors have done is that, like FAO, MacArthur Foundation, Darwin Initiative, and the rest, they provided funding that actually led to the development of Yala land use plan. So this land use plan has not been implemented yet, but has been approved by the county government of Busia. Busia County is yet to approve it, but it will take a time to have it implemented. But at least there's a step which had taken place in terms of funds provision for this land use to be developed. So there's also been funding for restoration activities, which has already taken place in Kingwal and also in Yala. Then looking at the policy level initiatives which have taken place, we see that at county level, Yala has a land use plan. Yes, as I've said before, that it has not been implemented yet, but is in the process of being approved. But Kingwal wetland has a wetland management plan, which should be implemented. And also the county government of Nandi has a bill on sustainable utilization of wetlands, which is supposed to now be implemented to reduce the pressure on the wetland in terms of cropping. And at national level, we have regulations which are supposed to protect wetlands, like the Ramsar Convention, even though it is not legally binding. And also we have MCA. So all these regulations are supposed to protect wetlands in Kenya. So generally what our node is trying to do is to explore, because already things are being done on the ground, but it's not taking the direction we would want it to take in terms of equity and also sustainable agriculture in these wetlands. So what the Kenya node would want to do is to explore innovative approaches that could bring synergies among actors, because here we have people who are using the wetlands for commercial use, subsistence use. The wetlands are also supposed to have ecological functions which are beneficial both at local scale and also at global scale in terms of climate regulation, and also regional scale in terms of water purification, like for the Yala wetland. So how could we explore innovative approaches that could bring synergies among actors, which both they have conflicting interests, like the local users and the private investors and all those people at different levels of environmental governance, with tailor-made capacity building across different generations grouping to promote effective environmental stewardship, complemented by the use of appropriate technological innovations. So this is the overall objective of our Kenya node. So this is our team. We have a relatively small team. We have 4 partners. and that is Egerton, Kaimosi Friends University, African Center for Technology Studies, and Boku. So, as you know, Professor Kichake is the one leading the whole team. Rispa, who is me, has a postdoc, Christine, PhD, Professor Julius Kipkemboi as the careful lead, Professor Mieno as an ICT researcher, and Caroline, Dr. Caroline as climatologist here. Joel and Nora and Valerie, those are the ACTS team. So Joel is leading the ACTS team in societal challenges or TLABS processes. So they're the ones dealing with the how do you diagnose the societal problems and the interventions and all that. And Nora is also there, who's a TLABS researcher. And Valerie Nyanaro is also assisting in all these processes in the TLAB workshops and so on. Then we also have Gerald Winkler, who is from Boku, and is our training network partner, especially for the postgraduate program, Limnology and Wetland Management. Yes. So all these partners, actually, it's not the first time we are working together. We've worked before, so they have a long history of collaboration, both in postgraduate programs and research projects. So the main thing is about problem diagnosis. So under problem diagnosis, what we want to achieve in terms of scientific goals is that we'd want to understand and also provide science-based evidence on the impacts of land conversion to cropping, to climate regulating, and water purification functions of Yala and Kingwal wetlands, and also to identify options for sustainability to inform decision making. So this is where Christine actually will be dealing, what Christine will be dealing with in terms of climate regulating function of the wetland. And we'll also want to understand the influence of policies, and governance on equity and sustainable utilization of the wetland. So initially, we had a student, Vanice from IHE, who was looking into how the policies are influencing actions within the wetlands. But I'll also look into how the policies, whether the policies are transformative or not, under the spirit framework, which we talked about during our postdoc forum. And Kenya Node will be contributing a case study on this, joining the Brahmaputra node on the write-up. So for the societal goal, we'll look into creating shared understanding of the importance of both wetlands and challenges that are currently they are facing in terms of inequity and unsustainability. So what we'd want to achieve is that we increase awareness in terms of importance of these wetlands and also the stakeholders to jointly frame the problem. And we also want to build trust because we realized that during our first inception workshop, each stakeholder was mistrusting the actions of another stakeholder, like the county government are mistrusting the actions of the local communities and vice versa. So bring these people together to sit on a table and talk on how can we use these wetlands sustainably and in terms of equity, and also develop roadmap for the future of the wetlands through knowledge sharing. So these are the sort of goals we want to achieve by diagnosing the problem. So I'll welcome Christine to talk a little bit about her work. Christine, welcome.
So, as you've heard, I'll be mainly dealing with scientific challenge in the wetland, which is mainly due to unsustainable agriculture happening in the wetland. And this is both experience in Yala and Kingwal. In the first picture, you can see that there is burning of the papyrus in preparation for cultivation. In the second picture, that is inside part of the Yala wetland where cultivation is being done. And for Kingwal, as Dr. Rispa has said, there is much grazing in the wetland, whereby the picture there show part of the wetland which has completely been converted to a grazing zone. And the problem of agriculture is because of intensive agriculture due to land being given to investors, and also extensive agriculture from the local community. Next. So we know that land conversion has a major scientific implication in the wetland, since the wetland loses its ability to carry out carbon sequestration or store carbon. And also another major impact is the reduced water quality, since the wetland is not able to carry out water purification. And these communities, especially those who stay in the wetland, totally depend on the water that is flowing through the wetland. So when the wetland is destroyed in terms of carbon sequestration, it has major implications, some long-term, some short-term. And for it, one of the implications is that there will be reduced cash, there will be reduced income, since if all the papyrus are cut down and there's no more raw material for handicraft, people will not be able to earn income through making of mats and the rest. And also, even as they carry out food cultivation, the soil is being degraded, and it comes to a point that the soil fertility has been reduced, and therefore even the crop production will be reduced. Another implication is on climate change due to reduction of the wetlands' ability to store carbon and increased greenhouse emission. So my study will be at site scale, and it will consider two temporal scales which are defined in the Yala land use plan. That is, they have how will the situation be in 2030, and how will be the situation be in 2050 under 3 different scenarios. That is, if business continue as usual, or when we have a balanced development pathway whereby there's conservation and there's also utilization of the wetland by the community, and also a scenario whereby there's total conservation without any activities going on in the wetlands. So we aim to provide a scientific-based evidence that will enable to identify options, sustainable agriculture, options for sustainable agriculture that will lead to sustainability of the wetland. And also from the results, we are planning to consider exploring if we can come up with carbon markets so that the local community will be able to benefit, and also there's enough carbon in the wetland. Yes, there's enough.
You had been lost for a second, but it's okay. Continue.
Sorry, it's raining. I think the network is fluctuating. So we want to ensure that if there is enough carbon in the wetland, we can do carbon marketing, and the local community to benefit from this, just like what is being done with the mangrove at the coastal region. And also, to back up our scientific evidence, we have a cross-learning going on in the wetland, whereby there's a local university, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, doing almost the same work on carbon sequestration, but using a different approach, that is AD covariance method. Next. So how is scientific and societal goals challenges related? It is, we believe that societal challenges act as indirect drivers of change that influence the conversion of the wetland, whereby we have private investors and also local community who all want to occupy the land and do cultivation. So as people continue to argue who owns the wetland, still there is no clear land tenure to mark up who should use the wetlands, where and how, and at what portion. What's happening is that people are continuing to use the wetland as usual. There's more conversion being carried out in the wetland, and with the business as usual scenario, we will have a more and more degraded wetland, which is not able to provide the ecosystem services as it is required. Thank you. I think I'm done. Joel?
Thanks, Rispa and Christine for sharing. I'd like to request to have sharing rights to share my screen from this end. I hope you can see it. My name is Joel. I work with African Center for Technology Studies. I'm delighted to be part of the Kenyan node in sharing the Transpath plan work. As is, our contribution mostly has been on the interaction with community, interaction with stakeholders bit. And the session today in our presentation is basically, building on what Rispa and Christine have shared. Importantly, with a reflection on how we can, the process of diagnosing and some of the insights that emerge from it. So generally, we use the T-Lab approach, and we picked this T-Lab approach basically because our thought was that it helps us frame the problem, and also it's interactive in the sense that it can help us get towards interventions, and we build momentum, and we've seen this momentum picking up among stakeholders in a way that then we can test different strategies, test different modalities of engaging and transforming the process. So as a diagnosis process in the beginning, putting up the T-Lab bit was resourceful for us. And we looked at it as, being able to figure out what the problem is and agree on that problem with stakeholders that, yeah, truly here there is a problem, and then have iterations. And in iterations, we did our first level of iteration where we had a workshop, had a review on terms of different reflections, and we also thought about how we are designing the next. And all this was fed into by our interaction with the different stakeholders. As Rispa mentioned, there was a bit of mistrust in the beginning, some literature, and also some real primary research, and that's part of what Christine is putting together. So ideally, in the end, it was how do we then build a reflexive space so that we can say, well, this is a reflexive space for us to look at the problem, think about the solutions, and also think about what exactly needs transformation towards that solution. So we're here to go to the second bit of this cycle where we get into really, these are the transformed systems, these are the transformed idea. But as a process, we thought this was very resourceful. And we'll walk you through one of as part of this problematization in the workshop. So in our initial action, we had a workshop where we went through these 5 steps of activities. We used a combination of methods. So we had, the seeds approach, which allowed us to give us an idea of what are the seeds of change, what are the things that people want to see as a difference, but right now they're not really commonplace. And based on these seeds, then see, okay, how do you want them to look like into the future? And then based on that, try to map out a future. And as you map out the future, you start seeing these are the areas, these are the action areas that we can actually resonate with in terms of transforming the ecosystem, transforming the process of ecosystem change. Based on this action, I think the first thing was about what is the current state. And this is sort of a story because the idea that there's quite a high population increase, there's more demand on resources and land, and therefore combined with the climate change implications, right now there's a lot of floods and there's a lot of drought that come at a time when it's not needed. And therefore there's pursuant to encroach these wetlands, these swampy areas, and in that sense, degrading the swamp. And what this means is that there's overexploitation, whether it's fishing, whether it's aspects of natural resource, and therefore biodiversity loss. And Christina has already mentioned the challenge around land tenure systems. And in the end, there is a finger pointing, and the finger pointing is basically pointing mostly to investors as the causes of the problem. But we have institutional issues that also we need to also consider as we look at the current state. And all these current state ideas actually came from the stakeholders and in interaction. From this current state, of course, then we were working toward what is this future? And this is a picture showing the interaction we had with the stakeholders, trying to map out this future, trying to think about what are the things that we are doing now that we want to reduce, what are the things that we really want to see into the future, and what is the difference, what is the disruptive step that we want to have in the middle. And this is the setting in which we have the Three Horizons framework. We're trying to map out what are the things, the first horizon, what are the things that we really want to reduce. We are doing them now as common practice. This is our current state of affairs, but we really want to pursue a reduction of it. Then the second horizon is basically the disruptive. What are the things that will let us jump from where we are to where we want to be? But after we've jumped where we want to be, we want to stop them. And then thirdly, what's the third horizon talks about the things that are really minimal right now, and we want to have them as the mainstream things into the future. And looking at this, we were able to map out some of the pathways into what we can look at key action areas for the future. In these discussions, aspect of community-led action was very, very important. And actually, the persuasion was they have to be registered and formalized in a way that it can enhance change. And that was seen as a step towards transformation. There's already mention of the land use plan that is both looked at from the Yala perspective, but also from the Kingwal perspective, and the pursuant towards governance framework. So how do we govern it in a way that there can be resource sharing, there can be a better step tomorrow? And important, it was about rule of law. Can we ensure, or can we move towards a situation where all partners, all stakeholders are actually following the rule of law and able to enforce it in some way? So this mapping to the future then led us into this 4 different pathways. And we did this exercise with the stakeholders, and you'll see here the pictures of the different future wheels. And these future wheels have from in the middle, what are the primary implications and what are the secondary implications. And in some of the wheels, like the one we are seeing to the top left, wetland being managed by the county government, the range of implications dies very quickly after the primary, secondary. Then there's a little bit less sort of potential impact. But where we have the private investor, and this is the bottom left, the private investor wheel attracted a lot of attention because the implications were endless. They kept on going from the primary to the secondary, but they were both positive and negative in some sense. So these are some of the insights that emerged there in terms of which way should we go, which pathway would lead us to transformation in the quickest way possible. And you'll see that there's a lot of emphasis towards let's have it community managed. And that's the bottom right of the screen. You see that wheel there as a future. But all this were being really discussed in the different discussions as we try to problematize the different perspectives of wetland use, but also transformation within it. In the end, then there were 6 points of actions. 1, the land tenure issue required, the rule of law enforcement and aspects of rights, access, and awareness. In the end, it was about how do we build edges, how do we build capacity of the community to be able to change, to be able to pursue change in different regards. Of course, the role of the government in law enforcement, but also in bringing in an environment of collaboration where multiple sectors can come together was also an action area that also required the next step of being able, how do we restoratively look at exploitation of the natural resources within the wetlands. The 3 other sets was about how do we pursue adaptation and conservation while we reduce resource conflicts. This is, for example, from gender equity and inclusion action. Are we able to include the vulnerable? Are we able to include the people who in the community who are not given the room to speak, as we say? And of course, being able to pursue community-led adaptation and action in some way. The last bit of action is about these systemic issues that requires behavior change initiatives. And we do believe that the transformation, the approach we are taking with the node, in the Kenyan node, is actually towards this perspective of behavior change. Because as we went along, one of the things that has emerged is that the way we are engaging, the method we are actually using can actually in itself be transformative. We've gotten requests from the stakeholders, I think at least 2 that I know of, that really want us to help them use the same methodology and the same approach towards challenging the different aspects of development that are emerging in their own planning. And then the second bit is that while in many ways we see evidence or research being seen as this big thing out there that only an elite group might be able to understand and communicate, we're actually seeing more appreciation of how this evidence actually makes people have that aha moment. Okay, this is why this has been happening. And when you're presenting this evidence, there's that interaction, appreciation of how we can build coherence among stakeholders and they can appreciate the broader picture. And of course, using media, different types of media for outreach is also generating some kind of response because it shows continuity for the community. When you think about we have one action, there's a bit of a break until the next action. In between, there's media and there's different material out there that actually makes us continuously be involved. And I think that's it from our perspective on this. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it back.
Thank you so much, Joel. So I think when we just to summarize on that in terms of transformation behavior, which is really what we can help in this within our system as a transformation process. We also have other aspects which have not been reported here, like we are trying to look at also how can the communities be able to detect some of these changes. So one of the responsibilities of one of our partner institutions, which is SCAFU, is actually to come up with an app whereby the wetland users can actually be able to detect these changes and how it is going to function. So that one is actually in the process of designing on what is happening, where Professor is a professor in ICT. So we are lucky to have somebody like that. So it's being done on. But we also thought as a node, we should not just leave it at the community. We would also wish to have maybe what we call climate change champions, which again also CAFU is working in towards that, whereby they can see how to influence the young people, the primary schools of the people living within communities. We are thinking of having maybe a competition, arts competition or something, or even an essay writing competition, so that we can make even the younger people, the incoming, the future generation, to be more aware of these issues. And that's why we are talking about behavior change. So I think with us, I do apologize. Professor Kipkemboi could not join us, neither professor. Unfortunately, in Kenya, this is the time for exams for universities. So it is a bit of a hard time for us to really be there. So I do apologize for them not being here. But basically, they are working more on creating the app and also coming up with these champions from primary schools, so that as we are dealing with the community, we are also dealing with the future leaders who will be the future leaders within these systems. And I think that is basically what we were going to offer you as a Kenyan node. Now we can, any questions or discussion, we'd appreciate. Thank you.
Thank a lot, Professor Kitaka and the Kenya team for a very nice presentation. And we are a little bit over of the time, around 10 minutes. So I think we have like 10 minutes for question and discussion. And so the line open to question. Maybe you can raise your hand or you can write down the question on the chat box. Yeah. So we go ahead. Yeah, legal head Leon. Yeah, I see you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for the really nice overview from the Kenya Node team. It's really interesting to see how it's shaping up and what you're doing. I have many questions, but I'll ask 2 that are a bit more related to that process of jointly coming up with sort of a problem diagnosis and then sort of the activities that link the science and the society, which you actually already covered quite extensively in the presentation. But one thing that I was wondering that maybe you can expand a little bit on is who is not participating currently, or who is not at the table, or who is very sort of difficult for you to get to participate, and how how are you sort of coping with that? Because I think it's an inevitable part of any process such as this one. And the second one is that I actually also liked the sort of to see the tools and the techniques that Joel was presenting, that we could see that you used in these workshops with the stakeholders. I think that's really also just valuable to share. But I also noticed that in these future wheels, it seemed a bit sort of discrete options. Either it's community, or it's county, or it's sort of business managed. And I was wondering, what about the hybrid mixed forms? How do you deal with those in these discussions based on these future wheels for the wetland? So those were the two of the many questions that popped up in my mind, but the two that I would like to bring here for discussion.
Okay, thank you, Leon. I think the last one, I'll let Joel look at the four wheels, the future wheels, because I think there was an interbreed, maybe just a question of why it was not come out very strongly. Because remember, there's a land use plan. We are not starting things from zero. So we are trying to utilize what is already on the ground. And that's where one of the scenario was if the land use plan policy is implemented, but I'll let Joel comment on that. On the question of who is not participating currently, I think our biggest challenge at the moment, but I don't want to call it challenge, I'm sure we'll get over it before we go, is the so-called investor. It's a famous name, so we talk of investor. And the reason is there are many issues behind it. So they did not come in our last workshop, but we are not giving up on them, because I think the workshop turned out to have been a very different workshop than what they thought would happen, because of the accusation of who is doing what. I felt maybe the investor felt not comfortable. We get them until the last minute. They were still coming, but they just never showed up. Maybe they didn't develop confidence, but that does not mean we give up. Even if it means now maybe we are thinking of maybe visiting them to explain to them that is not a vindictive kind of, actually, I think they would benefit more if they come for this session. And the other one was before, in the beginning, who was not there, the Siaya County was a bit shaky. But I think at the moment, the Siaya County, they realized this is actually a benefit for them in the future. So those are some of the few, until my team can add on something on who is not there. But I think
Can I give a very quick
yeah.
response? Because that's interesting, and it's also a bit sort of, I think it fits a pattern that we think we see more often, that sort of sometimes the investors or the private sector is reluctant to engage. And at the same time, I remember last week I talked to a colleague elsewhere in the Netherlands who had been in touch with one of the big company CEOs in the Netherlands, and they were saying, oh, but actually you should get in touch with the companies, but actually at the highest levels, because currently many of these large companies, at least they also feel that they themselves have a problem of actually getting in touch with communities and the public, and they see they need it, and they also in that sense do not always know how, because it is indeed also sort of out of the ordinary. But just a very brief immediate
Actually, we are engaging at the highest level. So we are at the highest level in terms of the company. So I think we'll get our way through somehow. Maybe Joel on the future wheel.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Leon. One of the perspectives of the last bit where we are presenting the actions is that we have a connection, network between wheels. And often that step is if the out of the four wheels, if there's a very strong connectivity between or among several of them, then you can create a very clear pathway with supporting the different good things among the three. So in the step, there's always that interaction step as part of the features wheel, that then comes down to the action areas. What are the action areas? What are the characteristics of the most ideal pathway? And those are the 6 characteristics we presented here in the end. So whether it's community managed or it's county government managed or private sector, but these 6 characteristics are the main areas to consider. Yeah.
And maybe just to add, this is actually was selected with the output of what we got from the stakeholders. It's not something we designed and say this is what is going to happen. That's why that was selected, but it was an output of what the stakeholders kind of informed us.
Yeah. Tagalog, the Kenya team, do you have any question? You raise your hand. We have from question from Anamika on the chat box. I want to know how diverse is your stakeholder. So maybe you can answer.
Sorry.
Yeah, Anamika had one question about the diverse.
Yeah, I just thought in
stakeholder.
case we will not have enough time, so I'll just quickly write it. Just very specific question, because what I understand is that the biggest challenge in TLAB is that if you have a really diverse set of stakeholder who understands the problem with various different perspectives, how do you basically bring them to look at it as a common issue or a common question? So did you really have a very diverse group of stakeholders? And if yes, how did you manage that? How did you actually mobilize them to think in a way that there is some commonality the way they're thinking, if at all?
Okay, I have an idea, but Rispa, please, can you respond to that in the beginning? Can I say Rispa? Oh, she left.
No,
Rispa? Okay, yeah. In terms of the stakeholders, because you know how we walked through the process of the stakeholders, identifying the stakeholders, you can just maybe mention something about the diversity and how we brought them together.
So for the stakeholders, actually, our stakeholder group was quite diverse because we had the policymakers and implementers, both at the national level and the county level. And we also had those who are dealing with this research, that is the research institutions and also universities in terms of capacity building. And we also had local communities who are using the wetland directly, and the private investor who is using the wetland commercially, and also knowledge generators in terms of the elderly people who have indigenous knowledge on the conservation of the wetland, and also individuals who are also doing their personal conservation of the wetlands. And for the knowledge generators, actually, we're dealing with the CBOs and individuals. And then we also have the NGOs who are dealing with the local community in terms of conservation of the wetland. So we have it's kind of 4 groups: the policymakers and implementers, the local communities, and the conservationists on the other side. Yeah, so that is how our stakeholder group was actually consisting of.
Yeah, but just to mention, we had a very long list of these stakeholders, and what we did as a team, we actually had a meeting, went through the list and identified the niche in where we think we need to get this, also with assistance, especially by one of the NBO, the CBO, which is on the ground. That is Nature Kenya, because they have been working with them. So they were also able to help us and guide us of the real influencers, the people who are doing that. And therefore, we also did, before we had this, we actually did an excursion and went there, and we were able to meet the people, meet the government, walk to several government offices and talk to several people. So we also gathered during that excursion on what the issues were, what were the challenges, what were the whatever, because as we met different people, they gave us different ideas. So when we were discussing on the list, on the really key stakeholders, we had quite a lot of information. It was a process. It was not just deciding, come in, it was a long process.
So
for inclusivity, yeah.
Yeah, but did you have a lot of differences of opinion? I mean, what I wanted to understand is that because there are all very different stakeholders, so was it very challenging to actually get into this process of thinking kind of similarly or coming to a common?
Yes, in the beginning, I think that one, it is a question of how the T labs, we run them. I think we one of the things we did, Valerie, not Valerie, Flora, Nora Ivy was there, was when we walked into this room after we identified, we treated everybody equal. Nobody knew who was there. Nobody knew anything. we decided to use our first names. They did not know who was there. So when we went around the first round of people really giving their opinions, of course, the opinions were so diverse, extremely diverse. Their demands were so diverse. The accusations were so diverse. They were just accusing each other on the table. And then eventually what we did, we said, you know what? This is the best thing because the people, you ask this question and we have somebody here in that question. So we put everybody together, even the government officers, nobody did an introduction. And I think that was the icebreaker. So now when the institutions now started coming to respond to these questions, Ammon started coming in. And at least by the tea time, now we try to create communication among the members, among the government, among the CBOs. So it is a question of how it's normally what you call the entry point. I think our entry point really worked for us. And I think it's because we were aware of the diversity and the opinions of the people that we decided we are not working there and say I'm Professor Kitaka. We are not working there and say I'm the district education environment officer, because that already creates a difference with the people. But when they did not know who was there, for us it really, really helped. So we did not do introduction in the beginning as intentionally. So somehow it worked for us.
Thank you, Kitaka.
Thank you, Professor Kitaka. And I think we run out of the time, and then maybe we had a very short rap for 3 minutes, and we come back at 9 o'clock Vietnamese time, depending on your local time. So in the next 3 minutes, we'll come back for the second presentation from the Netherlands. With the net presenters. So now we come back with the net presentation by the Netherlands team. And I see that the Netherlands team already uploaded the form on your right. So if you want to see more information on the Netherlands note, you can accept the right and see. So now I hand over to the Netherlands team for the presentation. So we go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mintu. And indeed, so we have the Living Dykes writing and the AgriCoast writing. We have almost finished. I think I'm the bottleneck to finalize also that write-up, but we will also finalize it later today and put it on the Google Drive. Maybe, Esme, I think you are doing most of the presentation, so maybe it is most practical if you can share your screen. But
Yeah.
I will do the first. What is it? I think 2, maybe 3 slides. Yeah.
Yes. Let's see.
Yeah. Oh, great. Wow,
Yeah.
that's smooth. Yeah. I didn't know how to do it. That's okay.
I was prepared.
Okay, so, yeah. Okay. So indeed, so mostly Esme, but also Alex and I will present. But I will kick off, and maybe we go directly to the next slide after having a brief look at this nice What and See picture. Yeah. Just to share with you what we will be doing, so that you have an idea of what's coming. But it's I wanted to briefly sort of introduce the structure of the Dutch node. I've done it before, but it's always good to repeat. And then Esme will mostly talk about our experiences in the Living Dykes project so far. And then at the end of the project, Alex will add a few relatively short reflections from his project, which is different from Esme's project on AgriCoast, but both currently in the Wadden Sea coastal region in the north of the country. Yeah, next slide, please, Esme. Yeah, so before handing over to Esme, I thought it's always good to remind everyone about the Netherlands node, because like actually all the nodes in this project, also the Netherlands node has its sort of unique characteristics, and in this case it's the IHE component with quite a large team of colleagues at IHE who actually support the Transpath project, sometimes sort of across nodes, like for instance where Charlene and Jaap are supporting this learning team efforts, but also sometimes actually maybe working more closely with 1 or 2 of the nodes on their activities. But the IHE Delft staff very obviously is also part of the Netherlands node. But then we also have 2 projects in the Netherlands note that are very similar to the projects as they are in the other notes, really more related to, let's call it maybe action research, linking science and societal stakeholders. The only difference with the projects in the other notes is that these two projects are not funded by Transpath, but are actually sort of funded via different streams, in both cases actually via the Dutch Science Council, NWO. And I noticed some of the other notes had actually really nice pictures with all this stuff. I think that is our future ambition for the next time I'll show this slide. Maybe we can add in the pictures of the people, because that actually works really nicely and well. But at least you have seen sort of roughly the setup of the Dutch note and the name of the main, not all the people. Actually, these are all the research people involved in the Dutch note. And with that, maybe I hand over to you, Esme.
Thank you, Leon. Let's see if it works. Yes. I'm happy to share a bit about the case study I'm working on, or the project I'm working on, which is called Living Dykes. So the case study is in the northern part of the Netherlands. And as you can see, it's mostly flood-prone areas. So we have to do something to protect the coastal area from the water. And my case study is in, I'm not sure if you can actually see my mouse.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, perfect. My case study is looking at this this stretch of land, which is protected by a dike. And this is such a dike. And we're now wondering whether keeping heightening and broadening this dike is actually a future-proof solution. So we have, of course, often known the sea level rise that is happening due to climate change, which makes that we have to keep on heightening our dikes even more, which can become very costly in the future. Furthermore, next to these dikes, there's often other things happening. For example, close bordering the dike, which is running on this line. We have, for example, a village with their church almost at the toe of the dike. There's a lot of agricultural land with very good soil. So there's a lot of sweet potatoes being farmed here. And here in the water part is a nature area which is very well protected by European nature laws. So there's often a lot of things happening around a dike, and if we have to heighten and broaden the dike, these other things have to kind of make space. So there's some ideas on how we can actually have creative solutions to maybe create a multifunctional dike, or a dike that fits the landscape a bit better. And one such a solution is a living dike, which is the subject of this project. And I put some pictures here, how a living dike could look like. So, for example, here you see the dike with a lot of grass where some cattle can graze. And here it's an intertidal area, so now the tide is high, so it's underwater. But if the tide is lower, then, for example, you could have a salt marsh, so a nature area with a lot of vegetation, which is important for a specific kinds of birds, for example. And we have a lot of areas where we have these kind of, we call them summer polders in the Netherlands, which are cattle grazing areas which can only be used during the summer, because in winter there's a lot of storms which make this unsafe. So a living dike would be a dike which protects the hinterland, but also an area in front of it which helps with coastal protection, but also functions as, for example, a nature area, recreational area, or agricultural area. So in order to kind of assess whether this living dike idea could fit for our Dutch approach, there's this Living Dykes project with a lot of different research parts. So the part I'm looking at is more on the collaboration between actors on how to realize such a living dike. But there are also other teams working on, for example, seeing whether the vegetation on salt marshes, how much it can contribute to coastal protection. There is some ecological research, seeing how salt marsh behaves during droughts or during the extreme weather events that we can we most probably get with climate change. There is some modeling being done, and also another more social science research project, sub-project, which looks at upscaling of these solutions. And I forgot just now to mention that these living dikes are often called nature-based solutions. So we're framing it also on to seeing like how is such a transformation from traditional hard structured dikes towards more nature-based solutions. How does that take place, and how can we facilitate such a transformation? In my work package, so in my research, I'm looking really at the joint action that the actors in the projects can do. So we want to understand this transformation towards nature-based solutions, and especially the key role that actors play in such a transformation, and what kind of collaboration they would need in order to implement a living dike or a nature-based solution. And why is that difficult? Why is it not very easy to implement a nature-based solution? Here are a few thoughts of actors in the neighborhood of a dike. For example, we have the water authority, which is the responsible actor for coastal safety, and they have this interest that the dike must remain safe enough to provide enough safety. But they also have to expand the dike, so they face limited space or a clash with the current regulations. There is also multiple challenges emerging in the area, such as nature development. Some salinization is happening, so whether we have enough fresh water for agricultural purposes or for drink water purposes. And a few actors are wondering whether we're doing the right things at the right place. Because if a dike needs to be reinforced, it's a big project with a lot of impact on the local area. And you have a lot of choices on how this new dike would look like. So what should we actually do in such a region? Like, what fits the local landscape? What fits the initiative of the actors in the region? How are we doing the right things at the right place? So there's a lot of interest around such a region. And we think a living dikes could be a natural solution for coastal protection, but that also involves that we have to work in a more integral manner. So there are more actors involved. For example, traditionally a dike was reinforced and was just the work of a water authority. But if we want to reinforce with a foreshore in front of the dike, then we also have to involve for example, nature organizations who are the owners of the foreshore, land tenants who graze their cattle on the foreshore. They all have to collaborate in order to make this new coastal protection design work. So there's also more sectors involved than only the coastal protection sector. And there's also multiple levels involved. So it's not only about the local level, but also regional processes and national regulations are involved within such a reinforcement project. And if we want this more natural solution, it also involves more dynamics and more uncertainty, because, well, nature is inherently more dynamic than a hard structure, for example, like an asphalt or a concrete dike. So there is a lot of questions on how would this look like? How would we work in an integral manner, and how would we actually make that work in practice and not only on paper? So that's a big part of my research. And there are two steps in my research that I'm working on. So firstly, I started analyzing the problem, which is almost finished. So how can we understand this key role of the actors in such a transformation? And if we understand the problem better, can we then design an approach, a method, some workshops that support this joint action towards these nature-based solutions? And maybe to highlight the first step a little bit, what I did, I used an analytical framework to look from a multi-actor perspective, because we quickly found out that only looking at a dike doesn't provide this whole picture, or doesn't provide the whole story. So as I already mentioned, other actors are involved, other sectors are involved, and they have their own way of working, they have their own places where they make decisions. So these action situations, as we call them, these are important to understand how a nature-based solution for coastal protection could be implemented. So therefore, we are working with the networks of adjacent action situations, which looks at not only one action situation or not only one institutional setting, but really looks at a broader network of these situations. So these places where people come together and collaborate, and these places where they make outcomes. So we're not looking at individual actors in relation to each other, but more in groups of actors that work together at different places on different topics and different challenges, and how this networks look like. So in order to get an overview of this network, I did a few interviews with key stakeholders at the different levels. And then I coded these interviews in order to get some conclusions on what their challenges are. For example, what kind of action situations are relevant for these living dikes. And then when the first conclusions were drawn and the first network was drafted, I discussed this with the experts. So the interview respondents were again invited to look at the results and see whether it was what they expected, or whether they thought it was valid, or whether they thought it was representing the situation. And then I documented this all because I went on pregnancy leave for a while. And then in January, I started working again. And now I'm writing up the scientific paper of this network before I start on step 2 of my research. So the next slide, it is in Dutch, so please don't try to read it. It still needs the translation, but this is the network overview that Leon and I made together with the rest of the team. Yeah, maybe it's not really time. It's a bit too time consuming to say something about the content, sorry. Yeah, so it's just an overview of that is quite a broad network. There's a lot of different action situations related to the focal one, and that there is also a very heavy national institutional layer which prescribes the playing field on a local level, and the local level has to kind of be creative within this playing field on how to really implement a nature-based solution. If you want to to learn more about this, please just send an email so I can spend more time on that, because it's a bit too much for right now. To describe a bit about how we came to the problem diagnosis of living dikes and how that worked, especially also with the societal partners. I started my PhD in March of 2022, and then there was a period of a bit more scientific exploration on the theory, also because it was not specifically my background, so I also had to catch up a bit on the more social science research. But there were also meetings with societal partners, so the project is funded for partly by also the water authority, for example. So there are these meetings where the project reports to the societal partners or the people who work in practice on what we are doing, and we're also creating a dialogue to discuss what are their challenges and how can we match them with the scientific challenges to find the common problem diagnosis. And then I also did a few more in-depth discussions with a few of the users of a Living Dyke, for example, to frame the problem a bit more for my specific case. And there were also a few meetings with the other social science research team within the Living Dykes project to see whether we could collaborate more together. And a bit later in time, I started with the data gathering, so the interviews and making the overview I just showed you. And now I'm really working on writing the scientific paper before, again, I engage a bit more with the societal partners again to see whether we can start the second phase and see if collaboration towards creating the method or the approach, if we can also do that in collaboration with this case, for example. So to conclude, before I give the floor again to Leon, I have two reflections on the transdisciplinarity aspect of this research, or maybe two challenges. One thing I found difficult sometimes to find a case as a researcher was that usually some people within a specific case study could see the involvement of a researcher as a project risk. So they are working on their own societal projects, and sometimes they were a bit hesitant to allow a researcher into the meetings they were having with societal stakeholders because they found it quite sensitive of a project, or maybe they thought it might influence the stakeholders that were present. So sometimes it was a bit difficult to be allowed in all the meetings or find a case study that really fit. But luckily, after one change in case study, now we're working with a very open partner who is very happy to help us go to the right meetings and find the right people to interview. And another thing I found difficult with this transdisciplinary angle was that sometimes the social science research was considered more vague or more difficult to understand than, for example, the ecological research parts, especially because we're working with a lot of engineers of dike reinforcement projects who are very very more focused onto ecology part or engineering terms, and then trying to explain concepts like action situations and these like social networks was a bit more difficult. So it really took a lot of building trust, and clarification was very important in order to still collaborate. So I would next time really invest in that at the beginning, because that's very important to have a good relation with the societal partners and have a very fruitful case study for your projects. But I know Leon will talk a bit more about the reflections in just a few minutes.
Yeah, indeed. I think when I introduced the structure, I forgot to tell you that I would also pop up somewhere towards the end, but only very briefly, because I wanted to put Esme's experience in the larger context as I can oversee it, which is of course also limited, but it's to also sort of acknowledge the iterative cycle, but also the sort of never-ending process of even problem diagnosis. I think we also discussed it on Monday in the two sessions we had then. But that is, the project doesn't necessarily start when the project starts, and it doesn't, as hopefully not finish when the project finishes, and the project in this case then being the Living Dykes project and connected to Transpath. But there is actually a history that preceded at least my own involvement in Living Dykes, but also the involvement of some of the other researchers and some of the other people, for instance, with the water authority in Friesland. And that was also a project on multifunctional flood defenses. It was called Be Safe, and that actually started several years before Living Dykes. And in a way, we all got enthusiastic as researchers and as societal partners. So we thought, how can we continue what is the next step that we think we need? And that is sort of how Living Dykes as a proposal came about and was developed. And when we developed the Living Dykes proposal, we thought, okay, we have some building blocks also to deal with these multi-actor challenges, for instance, in particular in Be Safe in that project. The postdoc researcher on that project, which was Stephanie Janssen, who is now one of Esme's supervisors from the Altara side, she developed a very limited but useful participatory approach to get people together and discuss, do they have synergies to do things together, to maybe start a new pilot together. That was an approach she developed. And we thought, let's continue on that thinking in Living Dykes, but now much more upscaling, so beyond sort of the pilot phase, and it will be an infrastructure that is there, or a landscape element that is there for really a long time. So it also involves this notion of maintaining it and managing it and operating it. That was sort of what we had in mind when we formulated Living Dykes. And then I think one of the really new changes that emerged as Esme started her work and started to talk to the people in the water authority and in the region again. One of the things that emerged then is that they really were struggling with this landscape of action situations, of not only being able to work on a living dike as a water flood protection concept and within a flood protection framework, but they also had to deal with all kinds of other policy and institutional regulations. And that was something that they were not so much struggling with 10 years ago, but that they were very clearly struggling with now. And that sort of also triggered us to reconsider and adjust partly, not completely, but partly our problem diagnosis, and which actually also was maybe one of the sort of early findings in Esme's trajectory. So that is something that I wanted to just share, and maybe on the next slide a few brief reflections, and then I will hand over to Alex to add a bit more insight from the AgriCoast project. But so what I wanted to flag here is, so it is sometimes a really long timeline and well beyond the timeline of any individual project. The problem diagnosis is never finished, but at the same time for research, but also actually for society, at sometimes we do freeze it, and we do need to freeze it to make a next step, either to write a paper maybe, and to do the research in a rigorous way that allows us to write a paper. But I think for the water authority also just to be able to do something with that dike, because they do need to take steps. But the speeds in which this is freezing and this is moving, that may vary, and it may not always be exactly aligned. And that, of course, makes it more difficult to manage. I think what Esme already mentioned, and which I just sort of echo, is the importance of the personal relationships and maintaining them and communicating on a personal level. And in that sense, it's also good if some of the people are still around for several years, but of course, there's always a lot of changes, and also the people that are around, maybe they are now around in a different function or position. And what I thought is also nice to note, except for the enthusiasm, which is very important to keep things going, but that it's not just difficult to collaborate as scientists with stakeholders in society, but actually also among scientists and probably also among stakeholders in society. And even if we are similar-minded scientists, like the social science disciplines, that we try to collaborate in Living Dykes. So those are a few of the reflections I put here on the slide. And then let me hand over to Alex for the last part of the presentation.
Yeah, thank you for the bridge to my portion of the presentation. Yeah, so AgriCoast is a completely different project than Living Dykes, but I think both projects link well together in the sense that they both are looking at, or at least looking towards, transdisciplinary research and also facilitating a transformation long term, even though the means by which that is going to be done is completely different. With the AgriCoast program, it's more so that the involved stakeholders are trying to see in what ways, and if at all, technological innovation can facilitate a transformation and societal change long-term. Meaningful, sustainable change is how I like to call it, because changes are not necessarily inherently sustainable or meaningful, and those are mutually exclusive. The way this is being done is within the AgriCoast project, 4 people are working on finding new innovations that A, have merit, and B, will fit into society. 3 of which are technical and 1 is a bio-innovation. I'm not an engineer or an ecologist myself, so I won't go too much into those. But they are very interesting projects in their own right. So if you are interested in that, please look them up and try to contact them. Myself, I'm looking at social innovations, particularly I'm looking at new governance strategies and also pathways that will aid adaptation, and again, meaningful, sustainable adaptation, and how you as a collaborator or authority or government can aid this meaningful, sustainable change. How do you collaborate? How can you facilitate this collaboration, etc.? And this is being done in conjunction with multiple partners that are all helping me hopefully create a network where I can investigate what governance pathways will actually aid towards transformative adaptation long term. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about my project then. So the main issue that I'm looking at is drought and salinization of groundwater in the agriculture areas of the northern Netherlands, particularly the ones closer to the coast or on the islands in the north of the Netherlands, and how the Dutch government, but also Dutch society, can transform these regions to be more sustainable long term, and how agriculture can stay an important cultural and economic part of these areas in the Netherlands, but how you can modify them or adapt, transform these to be long-term viable and not destructive to the environment, or how you can make these last to the 22nd century. And the angle I'm taking, as I mentioned before, is the technological angle. How can technology help this? This is more a backdrop rather than the actual focus of my research. But it is a good guideline to see how individuals, in this case farmers, but also the societal actors and politicians and government agents and public servants, etc., can work together to facilitate a transformation through these means. So what does this mean? Ultimately is that I'm trying to see how water as a concept can change in society, how we can make it a concept that is seen as something that needs to be sustainably used, rather than just a resource that is being used to farm. So a new position for water in society as far as values are concerned. Then following this, a capacity for people to actually have the opportunity to change, but also the willingness, which then feeds into what I like to call the equilibrium of nature, technology, and farming. So over the recent months, and also during my PhD, I think the main takeaway from this is that I would like to see and also hope to transform these regions to be more sustainable in the sense that the values, knowledge, and power relations connected to water in agriculture are being modified long term, and what my research can do for this. Next slide, please. And then the findings so far, and that's my final slide also, and then I'll give the floor back to Leon and Esme if they have some final remarks. So as far as the problem diagnosis goes, is that we noticed that there was a distinct lack of interregional and also local collaboration. That's the first hurdle we ran into, and also the first hurdle AgriCoast ran into. There's a ton of small projects and innovations and social collaborations in the region, but none of them are being connected or integrated or working together to actually provide change, rather than just an incidental hit to the status quo, which then leads to maybe a year or two of positive enthusiasm, and then we go back to how it always was. So that is the main thing that I'm looking to change, hopefully, with my research. Now, as I said, I think the first step and the main step that needs to be taken is that water, as how water is viewed, needs to change, as in move away from water as a resource and more water as a cultural and societal object that you need to consider in a more sustainable way. And then after speaking and observing and talking and walking and living with the people actually working in the region, there was, I would say, 3 main avenues that we ran into that we hope change in the future in terms of governance. Firstly, decentralization of the problem, which is a very big thing in the Netherlands. It's very it's a very provincial subject, or even more regional water, rather than a national subject, is actually causing strife and conflict and distrust with the end users, in this case the farmers. So there need to be steps taken that make it so that this decentralization of the problem is not hurting sustainable change long term, because decentralization can actually have positive impact, because it does allow people to find out a solution or adapt or generate capacity at the local level. Then we saw that leadership and short-term flexibility are also issues or impactful parts of governance of the drought and salinization programs. Leadership was seen as a positive thing. There's new actors, new stakeholders that are taking up the mantle of a leader, and the local end users are very positive with these new roles that they themselves have taken up, but also other stakeholders that have taken up, that are actually feeding back into this new meaning of water. And then on the other hand, short-term flexibility, which is what I mentioned before with these local, highly specific technological fixes, are hampering positive change, because again, because a solution works in a certain village or a certain area does not necessarily mean it will work elsewhere. And therefore, a lot of money is being, quote unquote, wasted because, again, it's slow, it doesn't cause impactful enough change for the region to actually transform. And then my final remarks, and I think this is also connected to what I would call like the transdisciplinary angle of this research project, is that there's practical problems that I've run into, which is time constraints and actually finding local actors willing to speak and give their experiences, but also from my personal perspective of avoiding extractionism. I don't think that's the right word, but extracting data and not giving back to the people, something that I need to solve long-term also, because again, when these farmers feel like they're just giving me their story, but they're not getting anything back, then that is also going to hamper their willingness to adapt, I would say. And again, feeding into this transdisciplinary angle, also, I feel like the program, and this is a reflection from me, has a distinct technocratic vibe, is maybe the right word, where certain aspects of this transdisciplinary work are being highlighted more so than the social angle or the view of local collaborators, which needs to be addressed, I would say, towards the later stages of this program. But good steps are being taken to include these voices, and this is where I think these transdisciplinary actions are positive, and thus ultimately I think the AgriCoast project will have good things to say about their own part of transdisciplinary research and how this is hopefully being published towards the end of the project. Yeah, that's my 2 cents. And I hope I was clear enough. And I did notice I went over the time, so apologies for that.
Thank you, Alice. So, Leon, do you want to say something, or we can open for the question right now?
No, we can open up for discussion if people
Yeah,
are ready.
okay. Thank you very much for the very nice presentation on the Living Dykes and on the social innovation. And so we can start for the question now. We have around 10 minutes before we concluding the session today. We go ahead with the question. So, hello, Ripper. We ask the question.
Thank you, the Netherlands Node, for your good presentation. I just wanted to inquire about the Living Dykes. Is it something which the stakeholders, because you're dealing with very many stakeholders in this case, so is it something which is acceptable to them, or you are meeting challenges when it comes to accepting implementation of the Living Dykes, especially for the communities who are going to be affected by the floods? Because there's issue of flood damage and also security in terms of, can it actually mitigate flooding? So is it acceptable even for the engineers and the ecologists and the social scientists?
I would say the challenge is not really that it's not accepted. I think a lot of stakeholders are really willing to take this step and work towards a more adaptable way of coastal protection. So a lot of stakeholders are actually on board, especially because the dike and its foreshore is looking like it's not working into the agricultural land. So the main stakeholders that would that wouldn't like this new way forward are like the agricultural area that should stay intact, but because that's the case, or that's decided by the water authority, the most stakeholders are really accepting this change, but they're really challenged on how to implement it. So they feel like they are restricted by certain regulations, for example, the nature regulations. So it's very difficult for them to find ways to implement it regulation-wise, but also where to get the finance streams, or who is really the owner of this living dike. So formerly a water authority was really the owner of the dike, but now it's also getting into the terrain of nature organizations, of these land tenants. So who is really the one who has to like take ownership of the whole project? Or can we then maybe divide it between different authorities? So there's this change of like whose role is certain aspects of this dike. So I think the challenge is more in the actual implementation and how to do it, then whether it's an accepted form of solution. The way it's presented right now, I think there could also be a lot of discussion or differences in acceptation when you would slightly change this dike. So in another case study, they're really looking at making a double dike, but that also means that a part of agricultural land should be sacrificed in that way. And there's a lot of discussion on whether this is actually an acceptable way forward. So for my case, it's a different challenge, but there are many cases where it's still being discussed what should actually be the solution. Yeah. Does this answer your question, or?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, and maybe to add a little bit, because indeed what, as May was saying, it differs a lot from sort of case to case, and that is what I also think, but I'm not fully sure, but what I think seen the regional water authority sort of try to manage in who and how they sort of give access to their case study sites, and the dynamic and sort of the community feeling or seems to be quite different in the case study where Esme is now working on more on the mainland versus one of the islands in the Wadden Sea. And maybe that was also one of the reasons that where Esme started out with one of those islands as the case study, that the water authority sort of nudged us towards another case study side, because I think the community dynamics on the island are quite distinct from on the mainland, and also in how much they care about the nature-based aspect of the living dike and who they
and maybe to add to that it's a very new role for a water authority to also manage these, like this community aspect. So previously they just made a plan on how to make coastal safe, like the dike safe enough for coastal protection, and they just informed the stakeholders. But now it's a more like they're working together with stakeholders, so that's a new role for them. So they're also a bit trying to find out if it's a very sensitive topic to allow researchers into this discussion, or that they're feeling safe enough to do it because, well, they have more experience with it. So because it's also quite new, I think we're all still a bit searching for our roles and how to like allow research into these kind of projects.
Okay, thank you, Asmi. I see Miyo rising the heat, so we go ahead with you.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Is a related question, like how much localized is the process? I mean, the construction of dikes, like how much involvement of local artists is there? Is it a pure engineering solution? So I'm just curious to know that. Thank you.
Sorry, my internet was a bit lagging. Can you?
No, I was trying to ask, like how much localized the construction of dikes, like how much local actors are involved, or
Okay.
is it a pure engineering solution?
There are quite some local actors involved if we look at a more natural solution. I think if you look at a very engineered solution, it's usually the water authority and some advisory boards. And but if we're really looking at this Living Dykes solution, there's also a lot of involvement of nature organizations, but also at the national level, then the policies that are being made about nature development, also at the provincial level. You have more stakeholders on a municipality level. Maybe there are some local initiatives that want to collaborate with this project. There are some agricultural stakeholders, such as the land tenants, but also the agricultural stakeholders that are behind the dike, so on the land side of the dike. So I think there are quite a few additional stakeholders involved if we look at the Living Dykes compared to the very engineered traditional dikes.
Yeah, and maybe I'm not fully sure if what the what was behind your question, Mizo, but traditionally, but then meaning, let's say, until sort of 20 years ago, for quite some time, it was very much an engineering driven process with national level guidelines developed by experts, including TU Delft experts, etc., on how to strengthen a dike. And it was maybe implemented by the regional water authorities, but based on quite sort of standardized national engineer-driven guidelines. But as May said, with these more nature-based solutions, and they have been around now already for 20 years, but sort of as the emerging thing, that has completely changed.
Yeah, thank you, Leon. We had one person on the chat room, Carlos. He asking for, are there any research about the advantages of living dike for climate change? Maybe you can report.
Yes, and it's also part of the other work package within the project. There's, I don't know if you want to know a bit more about like what those advantages are, or what you want to know about this. But I think the main advantages are that it's a more adaptable way of coastal protection, which is also in favor for the water authorities. Because of this foreshore, natural sedimentation processes take place, and therefore the land is heightened by just natural processes. So if we would now implement a living dike, it could actually grow with the sea level rise to a certain amount. So there are many advantages of a living dike, also under the circumstances of climate change, provided that there is not too much extreme weather events that would actually hamper the growth of the foreshore. But there's a lot of research being done on this topic, on actually how to kind of ensure that your foreshore is functioning enough for coastal protection, what happens under extreme conditions, and also maybe how it can actually help mitigate climate change, for example, by storing carbon in the foreshore, or those kind of ecosystem services. So I hope that answers your question, or if not, maybe you can specify what you would like to know. Oh, perfect.
Yeah, he answered that yes, and so we go ahead with Anamika. So we go ahead and always.
Yeah, thanks, Esme and Alex both. So I have a question first to Esme and then to Alex. So I really liked that, although it was in Dutch, I couldn't read it, but I liked the way you had prepared it. Just that I wanted to understand that when you made that chart of local, regional, and national, and then I saw some arrows, is it somehow also connected to the influence each of these stakeholders would have on the question that you are trying to answer? Is it also been arranged in that manner, or it is just the levels are just that from local to regional to national? That is, if you could just, because it's something that really interests me, because something similar to institutional mapping that we do. So that's what I wanted to understand.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think we didn't put any specific like national, local, or regional focus in the question that we had, but we indeed, based on this institutional analysis and development framework of Ostrom that you might be familiar with, we wanted to have this multi-level this multi-level ID in the network, and see whether that would provide us with additional information rather than just like providing it as one big network without making this distinction. And Ostrom uses also like different wording and maybe also different a bit of a different ID. But for us, creating this national, regional, and local level made sense, because as Alex also mentioned, in the Netherlands we have different tasks for all these three regions, and I think for water management it really lines up with a local water authority. Then you would have like a regional province that would do more like the regional process, and this national regulations which are bounding like the more local levels. So that's why we chose these three. But I think this overview is really also an interpretation of the researcher, and I could also maybe make a different distinction, and that would also provide an overview which would also provide information. So I think it would be a bit more flexible, and also the approach I saw from different researchers who use this approach, they also had different overviews based on their question. So I think it's a quite also flexible approach. And for us, we just use this one.
I actually that what you presented is also somewhere I was thinking, moving to Alex's presentation. I was just a suggestion. I mean, you can just think about it. But it's what I liked about both the work, and because you bring out all the institutions that work. Although Alex, you haven't done that yet, but I'm sure if you want that all the stakeholders who are involved in utilizing water as a resource needs to look at it from the perspective that we need to save water, we need to conserve or sustainably use it. I think it would be also interesting in your research to see where right now the decision is happening, how these decisions are taken. So I do see that you talk about power. So I think it would be very interesting to see that if you want to decentralize it and bring it, that means you're also planning to change the power dynamic, and you give more power to the local stakeholders to use this resource sustainably. But for that to happen, I think the first step would be to see where at the moment the power is and how this is letting those actors decide even for the local level. So that's the thought that came when I saw Alex's presentation. I'm not expecting a response, but I found that quite interesting to see as the whole power dynamics before we move to the question of how we reduce or increase power of some and reduce the power of somebody else. Anyway, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed the presentation.
Hello, thank a lot for everyone. And the time is up now, and we have two very nice presentations today by the Kenyan team on the wetland restoration, conservation, and also fill up with a lot of information on the transformation pathway, and also the presentation from the Netherlands North on the Living Dykes and on the social innovation. Thank you very much for the participants joining the online workshop today, and also especially to the Kenyan team and the Netherlands team for presenting the result. So maybe I hand over to Leon for concluding the online session. So I have to
Okay,
you.
thank you too. Yeah, I think time is short. So I will just pass on to Jaap if he wants to say anything to wrap it up. Also, as this sort of series of 3 learning sessions that we co-facilitated as a learning sub-team. But maybe Jaap, if you want to take the last minute that we have.
Okay, let's do it in 1 minute. Yeah, as mentioned already by all participants, I think it was very interesting. I wasn't at the first session, though, I need to say, but I see quite some interesting similarities where we can indeed learn very much from each other, but also where the different nodes are facing also the similar kind of challenges. And I think one of those things that continues to come back is how can we, and when we also think about transdisciplinary research, and well, we're also quite busy with impact. And so how are you co-producing that knowledge with these different stakeholders rather than maybe also being just extractive as a research team with your stakeholders in the workshop, but also how are you co-producing and communicating back and co-developing that research to support then also that transformative change. I think that is where one of the things that I take from these 2 webinars that I participated, and maybe also an issue in the first webinar. I found it very interesting, very nice to see the interesting work that is being done in all the nodes. I want to say 3 nodes, but in all the nodes in the 3 learning webinars. So thank you very much for sharing.
Okay, and then let me thank you too for facilitating this 3rd session, and let's thank everyone for participating, and for those who will be maybe watching the recording later, for watching the recording later. And let's close the session for now. Have a nice evening, have a nice afternoon, and see you at our next meeting.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.